BCA and have been for a long time. I've been here a short time, I guess, compared to some. I arrived in 2020, and ever since then, I have just really been fortunate in my engagement, my learning through BCA that has opened doors and opened my eyes to just the important conversations that are happening here in the Borderland. And so we just welcome you. I knew it was going to be a big crowd when the first person arrived on October 9th. I was standing out by the door and they came in and she says, "It's almost 2, I wanted to make sure I got here on time." And I said, "What are you talking?" And she says, "The event." And I said, "It's October, the event's in November." And anyway, I hope you made it, wherever you are. I don't remember, but anyway, oh, there you are. All right, you made it, you got a good seat too. I wasn't gonna snitch on you. Anyway, restrooms are out these doors and to the left, just right out that way if you need it, and as well down the hall on the right. But anyway, Celia, you want to come on up again? Welcome. We're just glad that you're here, that we can be a part of this important conversation today.
Thank you so much, Doug. Welcome, everybody. I'm so thrilled to see such a big crowd, and if anybody needs seats, there's one up here in the front, and then there's a couple scattered throughout. So I just want to introduce myself first. My name is Celia Bavir, and I'm the Executive Director of Border Community Alliance. We're a 10-year-old nonprofit based in Southern Arizona. Our office is in Tubac, and we basically run programming throughout the Southern Arizona, Northern Mexico area. Our mission is to bridge the border and create cross-border community through education, cultural exchange programming, and social investment. So we have a variety of information about upcoming programming up at the table. So feel free to take any of that and also look at our website for more information. I just want to thank the church, Doug and Chad, who's in the back.
The stream's not working for some reason. I'm not sure.
Okay.
No,
We'll try to delay for a minute or two here so Chad can get the live streaming going. So anyway, we really appreciate the church here always welcoming us to do programming and give us all different types of support. So thank you so much. I just wanted to introduce a couple of staff members that are here. Ann Gibson, who's in the back. Ann is our new, I'm going to call you new for about another month or two, and then you won't be new anymore. Ann is our new Tours and Forums coordinator. So if you are registering for a tour or have any questions, you'll be talking to her primarily moving forward. And then we have Susie Weber, who I think many of you know, in the back. Jerry Haas is also here, who's our senior advisor and former executive director. Are there any other BCA board members here? Okay. I don't know if any of them had snuck in. So I'm delighted to have with us today John Fife. I've worked with John for a few years now. We met in my work in No More Deaths, which is one of the many organizations that John co-founded or founded. And then we've worked in a variety of different ways since then. So I was so glad that he could come today and speak with you all. So let's see, how are we doing with the live stream, Chad?
I'm not able to get it to stream, but it's recording. So
Okay, perfect. Okay. Wonderful. We'll send that out. Thank you. All right, so we'll keep moving forward. So I'm going to introduce John and turn it over to him, and he'll talk for a little bit, and then we'll have some questions and answers, and I'll pass around a mic at that time. So John is a graduate of Washington and Jefferson College and Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. He served as pastor of Southside Presbyterian Church in Tucson for 35 years prior to his retirement. He was co-founder of the Sanctuary Movement in North America, which protected refugees from Central America from deportation in the 1980s. In 1992, John was elected moderator of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church. He is a founding volunteer with two faith-based organizations providing humanitarian aid to migrants in the Sonoran Desert borderlands, the Samaritans, of which many of you all are here today, and No More Deaths. On a similarly, if not more so, complimentary note of accomplishments, John and Mary Ann have been married for 60 years.
You better clap.
They have 2 sons, 6 grandchildren, and 5 great-grandchildren. So, thank you so much for fitting us in, John, with all your fishing trips and your many other volunteer activities. Here you go.
Thank you, Celia. You can have that. I got one up here. Thank you, Celia. I'm grateful to be here, but particularly grateful that y'all are here today because of the Border Community Alliance. I arrived in Tucson to Southside Presbyterian Church in 1969. And I've spent all that time since then trying to do everything in this Borderlands region on both sides of the border that would help me get educated about the history of this amazing place on the planet, the culture, the traditions, everything, the land and the mountains, everything that has intrigued all of you, so you have come here. But it's Border Community Alliance that focuses our attention on learning and establishing relationships throughout the Borderlands region, which is vital. And I'm delighted to be here as a part of that program. I'm also grateful to be here, Doug, to be in a Methodist church. My grandmother, God rest her soul, was a Methodist and a card-carrying member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And she never totally forgave me for straying off to the Presbyterians. Maybe I get a little credit for showing up today. Okay, all right. I'd like to start by erecting a couple of guardrails for our time together this afternoon, because we only have an hour. I promise I'll do my best to not make this a political talk on anybody's part. And I hope you will respect that guardrail when we talk together. Both Republicans and Democrats have failed to advocate and enact an immigration policy or immigration reform since the Reagan administration. It's over 40 years. We're not going to resolve that problem today. And I will not address drug enforcement or drug policy this afternoon. That's a completely separate border issue. And it's completely separate from immigration and the solutions and the reforms that are necessary for a just immigration policy on the border. Okay, can we agree to that? Yes. Great, thank you. So what happened? What happened in the 1990s to result in our beloved Sonoran Desert becoming a vast graveyard of human remains? Well, in 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement was ratified. Mexico was required required under the terms of the North American Free Trade Agreement to end all subsidies to corn and beans by the government of Mexico for the poor. They are the diet staples and nutrition staples of the poor in Mexico. And Mexico had always subsidized those products so the poor could be nourished. And Mexico was required to end all import tariffs on corn and agricultural products from the United States and Canada. The result of that treaty was predictable. The United States and Canada flooded Mexico with billions of dollars of corn and beans produced on corporate-style farming operations here and in Canada. Corn exports quickly rose out of the United States to Mexico to $12 billion a year. And that's at a price 24% below what Mexico farmers, small farmers, could afford to produce their crops for. The World Bank reported that 2 million small and subsistence farmers in Mexico were driven off the land by imported corn from the United States and Canada. They had only one choice to feed their families, to head north. And we knew it. The Immigration and Naturalization Service Deputy Commissioner testified before Congress in 1998 that they knew that the North American Free Trade Agreement would create what they called a sharp increase in migration on the southwest border. President Clinton knew that as well. He also knew that anti-Mexican migrant political messaging was becoming a major issue in the politics of this country, and that his political opponents were prepared to hold him responsible for any increase in migration on the border. So he went to the Border Patrol and said, I need to look tough on border enforcement. Help me do that. And they responded. Clinton had in mind that in 1992, during that election, California had put a proposition called Prop 187 on the ballot in California. It was called Save Our State. And really everybody got the point. It was Save Our State from Mexicans. The Border Patrol had tried a new border enforcement strategy in El Paso, Texas in 1992. Border Patrol had a problem in El Paso. They were getting all kinds of bad press reports on national TV. National TV branches had gone to the border at the Rio Grande in El Paso and filmed every morning hundreds of border crossers wading across the river and going to work in El Paso. Now, you probably understand that that was just a daily commute for lots of workers in El Paso who discovered that it was cheaper housing living in Ciudad Juarez and then commuting across the river to go to work in El Paso. But the films didn't say that. They were used in the '92 election and weaponized politically. And so the El Paso Sector Border Patrol, to end the bad press they were getting, implemented a new strategy they called Operation Blockade. They determined that by quadrupling the number of Border Patrol agents and vehicles and helicopters and technology, they could block that urban area with agents and technology and force the migration around the edges, right? But around the edges meant that the migrants were easy to arrest and detain. And it worked. No more bad press for President Clinton. And so what they said was, we believe we can amplify that lesson in El Paso to the whole border. And they determined in 1994 to roll out a new border enforcement strategy. They named it Prevention Through Deterrence. I need to say, here we go. Now the strategy is easy to understand. Most of the migration between Mexico and the United States occurred in a few urban areas of the border. Everyone wanting to migrate from Mexico into the United States did so in literally a handful of urban areas on the border because it was the easiest and safest place to cross. Brownsville, Matamoros, Laredo, Nuevo Laredo, El Paso, Juarez, Nogales, and San Diego, Tijuana. That was it. And the U.S. Border Patrol said, we believe we can seal off those urban areas from migration. We'll replace an 8-foot cyclone fence through those urban areas with 18-foot steel walls. And then we'll quadruple the number of Border Patrol agents in those urban areas and quadruple the Border Patrol vehicles and helicopters and technology towers. And we know from the previous example in El Paso that we can seal off those urban areas from migration. And they said, we know what's going to happen from the previous experience. We know people will try to cross around the edges of those urban areas. And they said, then we'll push the steel walls out from those cities and quadruple the number of Border Patrol agents again, and helicopters and technology. And as we push those walls and agents out from those urban areas, we know what's going to happen. People are still going to try to go around the edges. And they said, we know what's going to happen then. They will have to cross through the most hazardous areas of the border. And people will begin to die. People will begin to die. And that death toll will be a deterrent to other people trying to cross the border. And we will use those deaths as a deterrent and thereby secure the border. Do y'all understand the strategy? That's why they called it prevention through deterrence. In 1994, that strategy was implemented in a document you can look up and read all of the details. It was called Prevention Through Deterrence, or the 1994 Strategic Plan of the Border Patrol. In sworn testimony before congressional committees, the Immigration and Naturalization Service Commissioner testified that they plan to begin prevention through deterrence, the construction of walls and the concentration of agents and technology in Texas and California first. Because, the testimony said, We believe the Sonoran Desert will be a geographic barrier to migration. No one will try to cross through there. This is the Border Patrol testifying under oath. And the Immigration and Naturalization Service and the Border Patrol were wrong. They were deadly wrong. In 1993, 93,600 migrants were apprehended by the Border Patrol agents in the Tucson sector. By 2000, the number of apprehensions in the Tucson sector had risen to 616,000, a seven-fold increase. From that year, 2000, the apprehensions in the Tucson sector continued to increase until this sector recorded 50% of all border apprehensions, as compared to the other 2,000 miles of the border. Tucson sector became the epicenter of migration and death. Ooh, that's not working, is it? What'd I do wrong, Ken?
Finally got a live stream. I've been working on that this whole time.
Okay,
Let's see. I think you can just.
do enter, I tried.
Oh, okay. Might be arrow down. Let's see. Do you have a mouse? Actually, I think slideshow. Oh, it just disappeared. That's not good.
That's not good. That's okay.
Well,
You just have to listen to me.
yeah, let's see. It's there now. Okay,
You got it?
so then
We had prevention
next-
through deterrence.
there you go.
Right.
That's
Next
that's
one.
the slide that's up.
Okay.
Okay, and then just go ahead and hit the forward arrow to scroll to the next one. Here's the
The forward arrow.
This is the slide up right now, and then this is the next one. So your forward arrow here's right there.
Right there.
Yeah.
Okay, how do I go back? P?
Oh, back. Back arrow right there.
Okay,
That's
good.
that's full screen up there right now.
All right.
So yeah.
Okay, we'll work on this. These are quotes from the 94 Border Patrol strategic plan and the testimony of the INS director. This is a map of the Tucson sector of the border. Each red dot on the map represents the place where migrant human remains have been found. I'll just stop for a minute and let you absorb that. Our beloved Sonoran Desert has become a vast graveyard of open graves. Let me explain how prevention through deterrence unfolded in the Tucson sector. In 1997, after ramping up the enforcement in Texas and California because the Sonoran Desert would be a deterrent to anyone trying to cross. In 1997, they built a wall across Nogales. In 2000, the migration shifted from Nogales over to the east to Douglas and Agua Prieta and Naco area. And then they built a wall across that part of the border. And everything shifted over to the Altar Valley between the reservation and the east side of the Babaquibari Mountains. The superintendent at Buenos Aires Wildlife Reserve in that valley said that they believed that about 1,000 people a day were migrating up the Altar Valley during that time. And then they built a wall across the Altar Valley. And everything shifted into the O'odham Nation, and then to Organ Pipe National Monument in Cabeza Prieta. You all understand how that shift has occurred. While prevention through deterrence is unfolding in the Tucson sector, the Sinaloa drug cartel, for the first time in the history of this border, takes control of human trafficking in the Tucson sector because there was a lot more money to be made. Cartels take over control of human trafficking along the border. What had been a part-time mom and pop source of income on the border becomes a new source of income and cartel power in Mexico and on the border. It is the report of economists who are far more wise than I am about these matters that the human trafficking income for the cartels in this sector of the border now equals the profits that they return from drug trafficking. By 2000, the Border Patrol had recorded 2,000 deaths of migrants along the southwest border. That's the whole border. Mexico filed suit against the United States, accusing the United States of violating human rights and international law because of the prevention through deterrence strategy of intentionally forcing the migrants into the deadliest areas of the border and then using thousands of deaths and countless suffering as essential to the U.S. border enforcement strategy. In September of 2003, a 6-judge panel of the Inter-American Court, the judicial arm of the Organization of American States, ruled unanimously. And the quote, if I can get it, there we are, said, "The death of almost 2,000 Mexican and some Central American migrants is the strongest evidence that the United States has violated and continues to violate human rights by maintaining the strategic plan and violates international law as well." In short, the International Court found that a nation cannot use the deaths of thousands of migrants as an essential part of a border enforcement plan. It must be noted now that the United States knew by 2005 that prevention through deterrence had failed, however, because the migration increased each of those years. As all of us have noted, the number of Border Patrol apprehensions on the border have continued to climb on the border to unprecedented levels year after year after year. And yet prevention through deterrence continues to be the border enforcement strategy, and the death toll in the Sonoran Desert rises each year. And the international courts continue to inform the United States that we are in violation of human rights and international law, and the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees continues to inform the United States that we are in violation of international refugee law, human rights, and the 1980 Refugee Act of the United States, as do Amnesty International and Human Rights First and Human Rights Watch and everybody in the world. And each successive Republican and Democratic administration continues to practice prevention through deterrence. and pile on additional strategies when that has failed since 2005. The George Bush administration said, if thousands of deaths in the borderlands did not deter migration, we'll create a brand new private prison industry. We'll lock them up for longer and longer terms and create a whole new process for mass incarceration of migrants. In Tucson, it's called Operation Streamline. And that failed to deter migration. Bush knew that immigration reform was needed, but he failed to get it through Congress. And Obama, in his first term, became the deporter-in-chief. A record number of arrests and deportations, believing that he would be tough, if he were to be tough on border enforcement, the Republicans would join in immigration reform in his second term. McCain allied himself with Obama and got it through the Senate, but it failed in the House of Representatives. And the Trump administration did not try, as you know, immigration reform. Instead, Trump campaigned on stopping immigration, period. His first executive order said this: all undocumented persons are criminals and threats to national security, and we will treat them as such. He instituted a Muslim ban and starved all the funding for refugee and legal avenues for immigration that had been provided. He said he'd build a big, beautiful wall. And when that failed and migration increased under his tenure, he said, well, what we'll do is take away and disappear your children at the border. And that'll be a deterrent to people trying to cross. The United States population finally stood up and said, not in our name, not ever. He also adopted a policy called Remain in Mexico, that if you apply for political asylum at the border, you must remain in Mexico until we give you a court date. Human Rights First documented thousands of assaults on asylum seekers in Mexican border towns. Rapes, kidnappings, extortion, torture by gangs and cartels in Mexico. Then he tried Title 42, expulsions from anyone trying to cross the border. It was a public health measure that permitted the government to deport people because of communicable diseases. And all ports of entry were closed to refugees seeking political asylum under the Trump administration, and all undocumented persons expelled to Mexico within 1.5 hours of apprehension. And that failed, as you all know, from all of the accounts living in the borderlands. Joe Biden's administration campaigned against those policies, said they were inhumane and violations of human rights, and they had to end them. Except he kept Title 42 until May of this year. And Remain in Mexico has now expanded to Remain in Mexico, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua until you get a hearing date on a CBP One app on your phone. It has all failed, as you know from the news. All of that has failed. And the Sonoran Desert continues to be a vast graveyard. The open graves of the poor and the oppressed and those fleeing for their lives. Well, some of you say, I did my homework before I came today, And I Googled how many deaths in the Sonoran Desert, and it says, the United States says there are 9,600 deaths today. And that's what you get if you Google it. Turns out it's not true. The Government Accounting Office studied that testimony of the United States government and the U.S. Border Patrol, and a new government report last year shows Border Patrol agents significantly undercount immigrant deaths, with the number of people dying likely at least twice as high as previously reported. Funding provides more evidence that for many years, U.S. immigration policy has been ineffective, counterproductive, and deadly. That's the Government Accounting Office words, not mine. Continuing policies that rely on enforcement alone and ignore the need to offer legal visas for those seeking work will result in thousands of more deaths and continued frustration about policies that fail to deter unlawful migration into the United States. Customs and Border Protection has not collected and recorded or reported to Congress complete data on migrant deaths, and it has not disclosed limitations with the data it has reported, according to the GAO report. The undercount of immigrant deaths is significant based on the statistics that the Government Accounting Office presents. The data there indicate that approximately twice as many immigrant deaths in the Tucson sector than were reported by the Border Patrol between fiscal years 2015 and 2019. Since 1998, the Border Patrol has recorded approximately 9,600 immigrant deaths at the border. If the Tucson sector is representative of underreporting deaths in other sectors, the actual number of immigrant deaths might have been twice as high in 2021, 2022, 2023. And it was. It was. The reason for the statistics on migrant deaths in the desert by the Border Patrol and the U.S. government is Border Patrol has a policy of only counting migrant deaths in which the Border Patrol is directly involved. A Border Patrol agent finds a human remains or a migrant is killed during an apprehension, only then. The Pima County Medical Examiner counts and reports all the migrant human remains that are found and brought into that office. If anyone finds a human remains in the desert and calls 911, they are connected with law enforcement, not Border Patrol. Law enforcement retrieves the remains, investigates it in the field, and transports the remains to the medical examiner's lab. That's why Border Patrol statistics are only less than half the tragic reality. Compound that by the fact that Texas does not have any medical examiners' offices in the counties of Texas along the border. Human remains found along the Texas border are taken to a justice of the peace, and migrant deaths are not counted and reported as such in Texas. So we are somewhere over 2,000 deaths, 20,000 deaths now. Next, we are residents of the Sonoran Desert, and we have an understanding about how the desert is designed to clean up all remains efficiently, aren't we? Dr. Jason De Leon spent 5 years as an anthropologist studying this issue in the area around Arivaca and the valley east of the Babaquiviri Mountains. As a scientist, he placed pig carcasses wearing typical migrant clothing and shoes in the desert. Within 2 weeks, Within 2 weeks, the Sonoran Desert had completely reduced the remains to skeletal bones. And then the bones began to be scattered by small animals. Buzzards, coyotes, mountain lions, bobcats, and birds. Took only 2 weeks. Combine that study with the vastness of the Sonoran Desert. 70% of the border in the Tucson sector is federal land. Reservation, national forest, federal wilderness, national parks, wildlife reserves. Anyone care to guess how many human remains are never found? The folks who I have discussed this issue with, law enforcement, park rangers, fish and game officers, ranchers, humanitarian aid volunteers, all agree it's just a guess. The range is between 3 and 5 times the number of human remains that are found. All agree that the number is significant. I believe the number is 30 to 50,000 deaths in our beloved borderlands. The only NGA that's studying this matter has reported somewhere over 30,000 missing persons whose remains or identity has never been found. If time. Dr. Jason De Leon, the anthropologist who did those studies, published a book, if you're interested in the details, called The Land of Open Graves. I recommend it. He says in his introduction, this book is about the violence and death that border crossers face on a daily basis as they attempt to enter the United States without authorization by walking across the vast Sonoran Desert. If you live in the United States, you already know about many of the people. They pick your fruit and vegetables, they detail your cars, they process your meat, they cook your meals and wash your dishes in the finest restaurants. They build your houses, they clean up after you. My argument is quite simple. The terrible things that this mass of migrating people experience en route are neither random nor senseless, but rather a part of a strategic federal plan that has rarely been publicly illuminated and exposed. It is a killing machine that simultaneously uses and hides behind the deadliness of the Sonoran Desert. Now let's talk together about what that means for us.
Does anybody, do you want to start with questions now, John?
Sure. Well, questions,
Discussion.
comments?
I have a microphone though. If you do want to speak, if you could raise your hand and I'll bring you the mic, please.
Yes.
Your court case in the 1980s, you want to talk about that for a minute?
Sure.
I'll just repeat the question.
Well-
the question was about John's court case in the 1980s. Does he want to talk about that?
No. Sure. The church I served as pastor became the first church in the nation to declare sanctuary for Central American refugees. That was a different context on this border then. And why we got involved was very simple. About 1.5 million people fled from the repression and the death squads and the massacre of villages and the torture chambers of El Salvador's repression against the poor of El Salvador. You know, the church got involved initially because the army of El Salvador gunned down the archbishop when he was saying mass and raped and tortured and killed 4 women religious. And who were serving the church in El Salvador. I think they killed 12 priests and 8 or 10 pastors in El Salvador, but the real death toll was literally tens of thousands of trained lay leaders in the church, the catechists who were trained. So we could not turn a blind eye to that. The problem was that those people who fled that kind of repression and terror and for their lives, when they arrived at this border, were being captured by Border Patrol and deported immediately back to an intelligence screen at the airport, and many of them didn't survive even that. So what to do? We started a legal aid organization to help them apply for political asylum and to represent them in immigration court. And we learned within a year that nobody was getting political asylum if they were from El Salvador or Guatemala, because our nation was in military and economic and political support of the regimes that were doing all that killing. So, of course, our allies did not create refugees. Only communists created refugees. And so what to do? Well, if nobody was getting political asylum, a colleague of mine by the name of Jim Corbett, who was a lot wiser than I was, came to me and said, John, I don't think we have any choice except under the circumstances. If nobody's getting political asylum, we can delay their deportation for a couple of years legally, but eventually they're going to be deported. and said, so I don't think we have any choice except to begin to smuggle people safely across the border and bring them to, it turned out to be my church. And I understood what he was asking. And I said, how do you figure that, Jim? And he said, well, look at history. He said, look at what happened when runaway slaves were fleeing slavery in the South and crossing state lines and trying to get to safer and safer places. Some people, he said, some people of faith helped those runaway slaves cross state lines safely and without being captured by sheriffs, and formed an underground railroad to move them to safer and safer places. And he said, those people got it right at that period of history. They did what they should do, particularly people of faith. And I said, well, yeah, that's how I read history. And then he said, now look at the almost total failure of the church in Europe to protect Jewish refugees fleeing the Holocaust in the 1930s and 1940s. He said, it's one of the worst chapters in church history. It's a complete failure of faith by the church. And I said, well, yeah, I've read that chapter in church history. And he looked me right in the eye, the bastard, and said, I don't think we can allow that to happen on our border in our time, can we? And after some sleepless nights, I went back to him and said, yeah, you're right. I'd have to burn my ordination certificate, wouldn't I, if I told you no? So a group of us began to work with there was a Catholic priest in Nogales, Sonora, who was running a shelter for Central American refugees in Nogales because the United States was paying Mexico to identify and detain and deport undocumented Central Americans from Mexico back into El Salvador and Guatemala. So this priest was running a shelter, and he would refer families to us, and we would cross them and bring them to Southside Church. And then I don't know, it was probably after 8 or 9 months, a government attorney in immigration court came to our attorney and said, we know what those guys are doing. Tell them to stop it or we'll indict them. And after some difficult meetings, the only thing we could figure out what to do was to go public with what we were doing. Because nobody knew. I mean, we thought it was a closely held secret. It turned out it wasn't. And so we went public, and the way we did it was to declare the church a public sanctuary for Central American refugees, and tell the government we were continuing to shelter those folks in the church because they were refugees. So a movement started, much to our astonishment. I mean, the only thing we had thought about up to that point is, what do we need to do before we're indicted? But this movement started among churches, synagogues, and temples and Quaker meetings across the United States. And we had to sit down and learn about how the old Underground Railroad did it, to move refugees from here to all those places that were declaring themselves sanctuaries. And it worked. We learned that they had it right. And then the government infiltrated us with undercover agents and paid informants and tape recorded some of my worst sermons in worship services. And indicted 11 of us. But the turning point for that whole movement was a phone call I got about a month after we declared sanctuary. The guy called me in my office and said, my name is such and such, I'm a human rights attorney from New York. And you've got to stop talking about what you're doing as civil disobedience. You're not doing civil disobedience. And I said, are you kidding me? The government says they're going to indict us any day now. And they've said they've got us under investigation. And he said, listen, dummy. That's a direct quote, sir. He said, listen, dummy. He said, it's not you that's violating United States law. It's the government that's violating the 1980 Refugee Act. Right? Every time they deport someone back to the conditions in El Salvador and Guatemala, back to death squads and massacres of villages, they're violating the 1980 Refugee Act of the United States. And I said, ooh, let's talk about that. And he did, and I understood. And I said to him at the end of the conversation, well, what do we call what we're doing if it's not civil disobedience? And he said, I don't know, make it up. And so I went back to my friend Jim Corbett, and he came back 2 days later with a paper he titled Civil Initiative. And he defined civil initiative as the legal right and the ethical responsibility of all of us, all of civil society, to directly protect the victims of human rights violations when government violates human rights. Got it? Now that goes back to the Nuremberg trials after World War II, right? When the German generals and officials were on trial for the Holocaust, and you remember their defense? We were just following the law of Germany, right? Or in the cases of the military, we were just following orders, right? And it was the United States prosecutor at Nuremberg that said, that's not the highest standard to which we're all accountable. He argued it to the Nuremberg Tribunal. There is a higher standard, and that higher standard is human rights and international law. And the tribunal convicted the Germans, right? And since then, you all understand that there is a whole body of law, international law and courts that make those judgments now, right? And set those standards for all of us to maintain. So our argument during the sanctuary movement was, it's not us that's in violation of the law, it's the United States government. And unfortunately, the federal judge hearing our case in Tucson in federal court ruled 2 days before our trial opened that we couldn't say anything in our defense about 5 subjects. We couldn't say anything in our defense about United States refugee law, international refugee law, conditions in El Salvador, conditions in Guatemala, or our religious faith. So we didn't put on a defense. But the trial lasted a long time. It was 11 of the most serious criminals you've ever met. There were 2 Catholic priests, one from each side of the border, 3 nuns, myself, the director of the Tucson Ecumenical Council, and some volunteers from churches. And we were convicted. But as soon as our trial was over, we had spent a lot of time with lawyers. And they convinced us that if we couldn't get that legal issue into a criminal proceeding, we might get it into a civil suit against the government. The standards are different, as I understand it. And so we sued the Attorney General of the United States for his violations of the 1980 Refugee Act. And it took 3 years, but finally the federal judge who was hearing that case gave us the right to put the Attorney General of the United States, the head of the Immigration Service, and the Undersecretary of State for Human Rights under oath and take their depositions in preparation for the trial. And within 24 hours, we got a call from the Justice Department in Washington saying, wouldn't you like to negotiate a settlement? The last thing they wanted was those guys to have to tell the truth under oath. And so the result was we reached an agreement with the Justice Department that essentially accomplished what we'd set out to do. They agreed to stop all deportations to El Salvador and Guatemala. They agreed to give everyone who was here without documents from those countries temporary protected status. And they agreed to a whole series of reforms of the political asylum process that have since been rolled back by Congress. But we had a dance and called an end to the sanctuary movement. And then 2 years later, prevention through deterrence started, right? And we have tried since then to organize around what we learned during that sanctuary movement. And so Samaritans and No More Deaths and Humane Borders and Kino Border Initiative and Casa Esperanza and Sasabe are all doing that strategy of civil initiative that we learned about during the sanctuary movement and trying to hold the government accountable for their violations of human rights and international law. So that's a long way around that bond. So there's lots more work to do too.
Any more questions? I know there was one over here. Okay.
Yes, when you gave the figures on death,
Yeah.
the 20 to 30,000 or the 30,000 to 50,000?
Yeah.
Is that Tucson sector or the whole border?
No, that's the whole border.
Whole border.
Yeah.
Okay. That's good. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you have suggestions from where we go from here?
Oh, now you, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I know the principles, right?
Right.
The principles are whatever the border enforcement strategy is, it has to comply with human rights, international law, and the laws of the United States that protect our environment and the desert and the ecosystems of the border, right? Which we have violated all of those, right? So we're starting with that set of principles. And then I need to tell you, it's going to be a long struggle because, as you all know, there is no political deal to be made in Washington. We are so deeply divided around that question that we are not going to get any agreement. So it's just going to be chaos out there, quite frankly. It's going to be a long time, so we're going to need, Charlie, all you wearing Samaritan shirts and No More Death shirts and whatever. We're in it for the long haul because there's nothing in sight politically we can do. And I promised to not talk about politics, didn't I? Okay. Just to say, ain't gonna happen, guys. And I don't think it's gonna happen because we've never created a table for all of the nations of the world to sit down at and work out a solution to serious global problems. The United Nations is not empowered to do that. Now, we're beginning to do it with climate change, right? And I believe that we're going to do that. We're going to create that table before we burn up this planet and make it possible to negotiate a way forward to save the Earth. Once we do that, then I think the second agenda at that table is going to be global migration. Because one of the things we've learned over the last 20 years is global migration is increasing and increasing and increasing, right? And no one nation is going to be able to resolve that question. We're going to have to do it together. And we're going to have to deal with it as a global community. And once we learn how to deal with climate change, then the next question on the table is going to be migration. And what everybody's responsibility is going to be to those who need asylum and those who need to move because they can't feed their kids. It's a fairly clear mandate. And we can do that. We can do that if it's a global agreement among all of the people and all of the nations as to what our responsibility is and a way to enforce it. Now, that's a ways away. So we're going to need your help and support, and we can do that, but it's going to take a long time. Charlie isn't going to be around, and neither am I. But we're going to hand it off to our kids, and they can get it done. Yeah. Yep. Yes.
Okay, never mind. More questions. Go ahead.
Hi, I recently moved to Green Valley, actually during the pandemic, from Mexico, where I lived for 22 years. And during the time of the pandemic, I'm very well aware of how much more power the cartels gained in Mexico, and I'd like you to speak to the issues more recently of how the cartels are affecting those who are trying to seek refuge across the border.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I'm willing to open this conversation to anybody who wants to share in it at this point, because I'm not an expert on Mexico's both government and cartels. But I know enough to know that there was a kind of interesting moment, in my opinion, when the head of the Defense Department of Mexico was arrested and imprisoned here in the United States when he crossed the border for a meeting. I think it was 2 years ago. And Mexico, the president of Mexico was outraged and called the president of the United States and said, you cannot arrest a high-ranking member of our government for drug trafficking. And very quietly, he went back to Mexico without ever being tried in a U.S. court of law, which is where the charges were filed, and resumed his responsibilities as the Secretary of Defense for Mexico. That shows you how much influence the cartels have and how little the government of Mexico has. And it's clear that we have a joint responsibility with Mexico because we're the market that's buying all of those drugs. And we have, for 50 years, decided to deal with that question through incarceration of people who are addicts, which is about the most incompetent policy I can name right now. We have to treat the drug issue as a public health problem, not a criminal problem. Until we do, we're going to be doomed to enrich the cartels and empower them for as long into the future as we persist in that fundamental mistake. But the truth of the matter is that almost everywhere we are receiving people fleeing for their lives and asking for political asylum is where the cartels have established their power. And we continue, I mean, we've got one political party who says, oh, we need to bomb the cartels in Mexico as the solution to this major problem. I mean, it's just almost as difficult to fathom how we get a handle on those major situations before us when we know what has failed for decades now, both with immigration and with the power and influence of the cartels. And until we change our policies, nothing's going to change out there. It's really hard to say, but it's even harder to envision what the future's going to be until we figure out we're the source of the problem, not somewhere else.
John, if Dora wants to say something. Yes?
Dora?
So when we say then and now,
Yeah.
as you know, many of you are familiar with Casa de la Esperanza in Sasabe, Sonora. So when you're saying in civil initiative, I really want to encourage this incredible group of people that we need to start something now. The people in Sasabe, Sonora at this moment, right in the backyard of our house, are afraid for their life. They are fleeing, they're stuck, they cannot go south because the cartels are in charge of those roads, so they cannot go south. Many of them have tried and they have been kidnapped and they have been disappearing. This has been going for 2 weeks. Many of them are now getting to cross with no documents or whatever the term it is, fleeing for their lives in some parts of the wall. Because the Port of Angels, Sasabe, Arizona, is rejecting every single day to those people to practice their right to be safe. And this is happening now, and this is happening there. In what, an hour and a half, 70 miles from us? So what I urge you to do, if you can, write to Markelli's office, write to Grijalva, write to any political guy that has a power out there and said, you ought to protect this town. It's our sister town. Those people are on the way here to meet with you, John. I received this phone call from these women crying for her life. And they think that I have a power or something to bring them to safety. And it's horrifying when I have to say, well, I have to wait for lawyers or something to say something. So I encourage all of you to start sending letters. Write to these people who has power in Arizona or in DC that this is a sister town. We need to have the obligation to protect them. Thank you, I took your space.
Hey, you can take my space as long as you want to, Bill.
We have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Anyone else out there? More discussion points?
I'd just like to add to what Dora said, a little bit of background. It's been very lightly reported. There's a cartel war going on in Sasabe, a small community that has traditionally been controlled by the Sinaloa cartel, and it's been fairly stable for the last several years. There's a lot of stuff going on, but at least the community itself has been fairly stable. With the leadership vacuum in the Sinaloa cartel, another cartel is moving in, and they're actively at war fighting over this tiny little port of entry because of the thousands of people that cross through and make their money because of that. So that's what's happening, and it's happened in the last couple of weeks, and that's why the situation is so desperate now.
Yep.
It's not even safe for us to go over there and help folks anymore, because it's total chaos.
Yep.
Just as Dora said, an hour and a half from here.
It's true. It's true.
Any more questions for John? Oh, okay, one more here.
So I understand what you're saying about how this is going to be a very long-term process that we're all going to have to go through. What do you do on the dark days when you think, good grief, are we ever going to get there?
I am a product of the civil rights movement. I was in college and seminary during the 60s. One of the things I learned from those old men and women who were my leaders, my idols during the civil rights movement, they changed the whole shape of this country in a short period of time. And at one of those meetings with people I thought were saints, when the Civil Rights Law was passed and the Voting Rights Act, and we got a lot of the legislation that we'd asked for through Congress. At a meeting, I'm sitting in the meeting and I'm young, and I'm saying, we changed the whole damn world in a short period of time. And all those old folks said, sit down, son. And they began to talk to me about decades of struggle and sacrifice and Jim Crow and segregation and slavery before that. And I've always tried to remember that. We only get so long on this planet. And we all get handed the responsibility to make it a better place and to do the work and to take the risks sometimes. But it's part of a long history that we're part of. And all we can ask is that when we hand it off to our kids and grandkids, that we can say we did the best we could with that one. Understanding that this is long-term struggle. It always has been. And it's only naive young person like me that would ever say anything different. So when you get discouraged, everybody does, and you need a break, you understand you're part of a larger community. And I'm looking at lots of you right now that care deeply about this, that support it, that will help, that will take it over if you can't. And will continue the struggle. And eventually, as Dr. King said, the arc of history is long indeed, but it always bends toward justice. And he was right. I believe that. I believe that's true. And I want to be a part of that. I hope all of you sign up for that same deal. Okay.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you so much for those words. And thank you for all of you here that are part of this movement. As John described it,
That was
continuing
awesome.
movement that goes through
Thank you.
different evolutions, but it's the same movement. So thank you, all of you, for doing that good work. I did want to announce an upcoming event because it's slightly related to this one in terms of it's related to migrant artwork. We have an upcoming exhibit at our office in Tubac called Bordando Esperanza. That's going up actually Friday. It's coordinated by Artisans Beyond Borders, which some of you may have heard of, and it's a rotating exhibit that's been traveling different places across the country, actually. So we're lucky to have it in our office space for about a month, starting on Friday. And then we'll be having a presentation about it Saturday, November 18th. Lika Macias, who runs Casa de la Misericordia, who some of you know, she'll be there to speak, as well as Wendy Lopez, who's one of the artisans. And they'll be talking about the project and what doing artwork means for folks staying at CASA and the many other places that are part of this project in terms of a therapy and a way of building a community and how important that is. So I invite you to this event in about a week and a half. So thanks everybody for coming today. I really appreciate your interest, and I hope to see you at another BCA event or two or soon. Thank you.
Thanks.